Hey guys, a few months ago we had this little project which was basically a one app controller where we got started on how to build an API using Rails. And today we're actually gonna go back to that one page project and take it a bit further using the Blueprinter gem, which is super useful. So basically what it does is it's just something that is gonna parse the data into JSON and allow you to actually structure how you want to render the JSON pages, the endpoints in an easy way, and it's much cleaner. So what you can do is you can, even if you followed the tutorial from last time, you can go to my profile. I'll have the link in the description of the video, and let's just clone this project. The reason why I want you to clone it, even if you follow the tutorial from before that, is because I actually added a few more stuff. So I added seeds, and I also added an API controller and an extra model just for the sake of this tutorial where I want to use it as an example. So once cloned, let's move into that folder and we can get started. So the first thing you actually want to do is db create. So you're gonna have to run Rails db create, db migrate, and db seed. I don't need to run that because I already have everything set up for my database, but you probably don't. And once you have that done, let's fire up the server and go to Postman and just check that our endpoints are working as expected. So you should have 3 nodes and it's all fine. The endpoint is located at API/v1/nodes, of course. You can see that in your routes. So let's stop the server for now and go to the Blueprinter documentation. So if you Google Blueprinter gem, the documentation is very straightforward. Of course, actually using it and installing it is very, very easy. So here is an example on how to use it, but what we want is this, so that they get started, installation. We're going to add the gem Blueprinter to our gem file. And actually, if you would scroll a bit further down, you need to be sure that you have OJ installed as well. So let's do both at the same time. Blueprinter and OJ. And we can run bundle. Great. And so we need to create an initializer file for the Blueprinter, and we're just going to copy and paste this in there. So if we go to config, initializers, let's create a new file, blueprinter.rb, and just paste that. Awesome. And so if you realized before, we had an example here already on how to use it. There are some further down, I believe, or no, actually here. So there's all of the documentation very, very well structured. But what really interests us is this part here to get started. So we can create a class that takes the model name and followed by blueprint, and it inherits from Blueprinter base. So let's copy that. And you can identify it however you'd like. We'll use ID in our case and then pass in the fields. So let's just try out our first. So a cleaner way to do that is let's create a folder with an app and let's call that blueprints. And in there we can have all of our blueprints. The first one is going to be for our node model. Node blueprint.rb. And so let's give it the class name, and it inherits from blueprint base. Awesome. So let's test this out. The identifier for us is going to be is going to be the ID. Come on. And fields. So first let's try using just title and see if that actually works. So we can fire up the server, but also let's go into Rails console. And so if you see here the example, supposedly we can use puts and just call the class and pass it whatever we want to output. So let's try it. Note blueprint.render node.first. And you can see that it's working. We are only getting the title because we specified within our blueprint that we only wanted the title. So that's great. It seems like it's working. So we can actually use it in our controllers to render those blueprints on our endpoints. So let's go to our controller. API v1 nodes controller. Great. So you see how we are always rendering as JSON and then passing in the collection or the record that we want to be rendered. And we're doing that for each time. So you might wonder, but what is the difference? That's actually shorter than using the nodes blueprint. But it is in that case, obviously, because our app is so small. But once you get bigger apps and you need your code to be well structured, especially when those records actually have associations, it gets much easier. And so let's just start using it and see while we go along. So in the index, we want to render JSON and we want to render node blueprint render, and we will render the collection of nodes, right? And so let's see what happens now. So we can see that it's working. Since in our blueprint we only specify title, we only get title back. So we can specify the body and get the body back. And so what's great with this is that once you want to use it in different endpoints, you only need to call it, or if it's associated with another model, you will only need to call association, which we are going to cover in a little bit. You only need to call that on it, and you can actually specify a view, so you can divide your blueprint into different views, and whenever you call the blueprint, you can specify which view you want. So let's create our first view, and let's just call it normal for now. So we want a view called normal. It takes a block, and from within that block, this is everything that is going to be rendered. So our normal view is just going to take the title and the body, and we can, for example, pass in the created at just to have more stuff. And so if we try it now, we only get the ID because we didn't actually call it from within our controller. So how do you specify that? It's very simple. You just pass in as another argument the view, and you say which view you want. So in our case, we want the normal view. And there we go. So this is what we wanted, and this is what we got back. Great. So in the seeds, I created some, I think I created only one comment. And so what happens if we actually want to see that comment on there? So we don't see them, and we want to see the associations. So we can actually look at the documentation. And I think there is a section for associations. There it is. And so you can actually pass in within a view association, what is the association and which blueprint it's referring to. So in that case, we don't actually have a blueprint for comments yet. So we will need to create it first. So let's do that. Comment blueprint. I am going to. You probably guys don't see that. I'm so selfish. You probably don't see what I'm doing. Super sorry. That must be better. Okay, so we want to pass in the association to comments, but first we need to create the comment blueprint. Identifier is going to be ID as well. Don't forget to change the class name. We will have the normal view for this one as well. And the fields, the comment only has a body actually, and the nodes ID. Let's remove even the created at. We only want to see fields body. So in our nodes blueprint now we can specify that we have an association to comments, and the blueprint is comment blueprint, and the view is, do I need a comma here? We're gonna check that. The view is normal as well. So let's just check, did I need a comma? Blueprint. Well, it doesn't even say it, so let's just see by ourselves. Okay, so we did not need a comma. You can see that for each node we're getting an array of comments, and these ones don't actually have comments, but you can see that the first one had a comment and we get the array of comments. So that's great. So now we use the blueprint to access associations, and that way you can really structure everything so much better. So that's actually pretty much it for the blueprinter part, but I still want to take this video a little bit further. So when you realize that, for example, we've been using a lot of times the same code when it comes to, for example, render JSON, every time writing render JSON, which is not very nice, and it gets even tougher when you actually have to render JSON if there is actually something to render, otherwise we will render the errors, and that's not a very clean way to do it, at least I don't think so. So what we are going to do is we are going to define two methods to return to render JSON based on whether there is something to render or if it's an error. And we will do that on our API controller. And so the first one is going to be the one that we render whenever something is successful. So when there's no errors and we get actual data, we want to have a success method for that. That method is going to take arguments, of course. And so if we go to our nodes controller, and let's copy this part. So we basically need to replicate this. So it's true that like when I'm showing you this example right now, it doesn't really make sense to want to even extract this part because it's not even that long. But the thing is, you don't usually send the endpoints like this just with data. So you will send, for example, you would send it as actually success true, so that front end knows, and then you would pass in the payload. So the payload would be the actual data, and then you would also want to pass the status, right? So you want to actually control that part. So in that case, it's status okay, and this is how something is wrong. Unexpected nodes controller render JSON success true payload. My bad. Okay, so we want to render it as a hash actually, which is a method from Blueprinter. Super sorry. Otherwise, we're actually parsing JSON within JSON, and it just gets weird. So this is what we would get, right? And this is a kind of a convention. So to have the success, control the status, and send it within a payload. When I work, I usually send it within payload, and then I send data so that the payload actually can contain like further objects. So one object is for the data, and another object is, for example, I don't know, pagination and other stuff. So you can see that this already is getting messier because we're writing it once, but then if there is an error, we would write a different one, but we would pretty much be repeating ourselves so much, and it just doesn't look nice on our controller. So we will go back to defining our methods, and our method is going to take two arguments. So as you might have guessed already, the first one is the payload, and the payload is going to be an empty hash. The second argument is the code, and we are initializing it at nil. Why are we initializing the code as nil? It's because we want to allow whoever is going to use this method to actually pass in status as an argument in case they want to overwrite what we will do within that method. So by default, we will send it as a status okay, and otherwise if someone wants to overwrite it, we will let them overwrite it. So for those who don't know this syntax, it's basically saying we are setting it to okay if it's nil. If it's not nil, then we actually don't touch it and we leave it as it is, right? So in that case, whoever calls this method and assigns code to, for example, status not found, then the code would see, okay, it's actually not nil, its status not found, so I'm not going to assign it to okay. The second argument then is going to be what we render within our JSON part. So we see here that we always use the same syntax. So we can just take that and put it inside of our method. And this part is going to be dynamic. So we will send in success true. We always want it to be success true, because if we call success, it means it succeeded. Otherwise, we won't. So call success true, and then we pass in the payload. And the payload will be equal to whatever we pass in here when we call that method. And that should be it, of course. After the payload, we also want to render the code. Status code. And so let's try this method out. Now, instead of doing this whole thing, we can remove this. We can remove this. And this. And just call our method. I'm not passing in parentheses, which might be confusing, so let's actually let's just put the parentheses. We're calling the method, first argument. We're not passing the second argument, remember, so the code is going to set it to OK. So let's save that and try it on Postman now. And there's a mistake, undefined method success. Now the reason is because when I made the changes on the app, I forgot to make that nodes controller inherits from API controller. So let's just change that. And you can see that we get the same results, but in a much cleaner way when you look at the controller. So this is much cleaner. And so we can obviously reuse it. But first, let's define the fail one. So the one that we would get whenever something fails. You can have more than just fail. You can have not found, etc. But for this tutorial, we will just do another one called fail. And fail is not going to take a payload, but it's going to take errors, because we will only call it whenever there is an error. And it's also going to take a code. And so what is errors going to be equal to? So errors is going to be the array of errors that you get from a record. You know, Rails gives you an array of errors if you call whatever. So in the case of nodes, you would call node.errors. You would get an array of errors. So this is what it's going to be equal to whenever we call it. But what if we actually want to return a custom error? Like, for example, let's say for example, on show, when we do node.find. So node is equal node.find, and actually this should be find by ID, and I'll show you why in a second. Node.find by ID, and then we pass in the params. And so if this doesn't exist, if here we pass an ID that doesn't exist, like let's say 100, and we don't have that node, we would want to return a specific, for example, node not found. And that is not an array, it's actually a string, and it wouldn't look very nice to every time just do this. So we are going to take care of that within our method. So when you do errors, and we will just set it as an array within here. So whatever is passed here, we turn it into an array, but only if it's a string. So we'll say if errors is a string. So if errors is a string, turn it into an array basically. Then we want to do the same thing we did with the code, but this time it's going to be let's just put in processable entity, and again we call the render JSON at the end, except that this time it's going to be false, and we will send errors. Let's try this out now. So let's just return method, and here we say testing. We're just checking, so this is the show, so we need to pass in an ID here, and we can see that we get an array of errors, success, false. So it's great, it's working. Obviously we don't always want to return this, so we're going to change it. So we are returning fail if or unless there is a note. That's cleaner. Note not found. Otherwise we would just render the usual, which would be basically the note. So we can actually copy that. Okay, so we see that note 1 actually exists, and we get it back, and we even get its comments because we're using the same blueprint. But if we would put 100 here, we would get an error message. It's working, and again, we are just going to use it one last time for the create because I want to show you what happens when you actually pass in an array of errors. So we would return fail node.errors.full messages. This is a Rails built-in method, you probably know. Unless node.save. So if it saves, we don't want to return errors, of course. And then we call the success method. And we render the note that we just created. So let's try creating a note now. The endpoint should be notes, but it's a post request, and it takes a body. So let's pass in a title, test, and let's actually make it fail. So there is a validation on the note. Oops. Note model. There's a validation for body and title. We're making sure that it needs to be present. So this should return an error, and let's make sure that we actually catch that. So you can see that you get an array of errors. Body can be blank. And if you would even leave that, you would get both errors within that array. So that's exactly what we need. So let's put this back, and now let's actually make it succeed and see if that works. And it does. So we actually created a new record. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. Just one last thing. So I did mention before, why are we doing actually the find by? Sorry, I was doing something offline for a second. So why are we doing this and not the usual find? And the reason is because when you do the find and you pass in an ID, and if this ID does not exist and this record is not found, Rails is actually raising an active record error. So instead of failing here, it would actually fail here. And that's not exactly what we want. So let's just see what actually we get here. So if I do get request again to nodes and an ID that does not exist, we don't actually get the payload with the proper error message, but we get a not found 404, and it's an active record error. Cool, so that's pretty much it. Hope it was helpful, and hope you guys are hacking like crazy. Cheers.